Well, we've come to the end of 2016, and I think it's safe to say that where we've ended up is not exactly where people expected to be in many different ways. But tracking the issues this year and explaining it to our readers were the weekly's three reporters, City Hall reporter Gennady Sheyner, education reporter Elena Kadvany, and general assignments reporter Dremann. We thought today that we would highlight a couple of the main issues that each journalist has covered and give you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look at what it took to cover those issues and where we've ended up and where we started out at the beginning of the year. We're going to start with Gennady. Your issue this year was what?
Well, it has everything to do with housing, and it started in January, just like the year, and basically the council had its first big kind of retreat, and they were discussing a little survey that they took of the citizens the prior year. And there were a few alarming things, like basically a recognition by many people in the community that Palo Alto is no longer as inviting a place to retire as it used to be. That percentage has been slipping for years, and it's gotten to like 52% from 68 a decade ago. And just a year prior, it was 60%. So it's been dropping, and a huge part of that has to do with housing costs. When you look at affordability of housing, which Palo Alto has been struggling with for a long time, but last year it fell from like 27% of the people who were thinking the city does a good job to a measly 20%. So at that point, there was a general recognition that it's a problem, but it has been a recognition for some time. But then in May, when the city was trying to tackle a different problem, traffic, they did another survey, basically of the traffic problems, to see whether a local tax to come up with solutions would make sense. And lo and behold, the survey came back, and it seems like housing is now way higher priority than traffic is.
Solving traffic.
Yeah, 76%. And so from then on, housing has been kind of the most talked about thing at City Hall. There's a new consensus emerging, and we can get more into that.
Yeah. Well, I found it interesting, even at the beginning of the year. Yes, we were talking about traffic. We were also talking about parking, and we were talking about development, office cap, and that kind of thing. And housing just sort of emerged, even though there's been some discussion over the past years. Interesting what you said about the seniors and Palo Alto being a not desirable place to retire to. Mostly because I think that a lot of people who are living in Palo Alto, and this may be erroneous, but have their homes already, and they're fine with just staying there. But the affordability question has come up in different iterations of housing, whether that's accessory dwelling units, granny units, and micro units as well.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and there's always been kind of like a percentage of the population has been saying for many years that there's a big affordability crisis when it comes to housing. This year, housing crisis was kind of like my term of the year. You've been hearing the term housing crisis from all corners. Yeah. It's no longer just the people like Palo Alto Housing or the Palo Alto Forward who's talking about it. It's pretty much something that's widely acknowledged, and it had huge ramifications when it comes to the comprehensive plan, which the city is going to adopt next year, and it's going to shape the vision for the next couple of decades. And it had huge ramifications for the November election, which we saw the swing from the sort of less growth to maybe a little more growth on the council.
Yeah. Housing in terms of affordability, before the beginning of this year, there was the move to save Buena Vista Mobile Home Park. So we were talking about very low income people wanting to keep that segment within the community for the sake of diversity and because they're residents here and members of this community. And then on the other hand, there were a whole lot of people talking about, $3 million homes, the median price going up and up. This discussion this year, not just at those ends. This discussion is squarely in the middle, isn't it?
Absolutely, and you've had much more discussions this year than in the past about teachers, public workers, firefighters, police officers, those kinds of people having a place to live in Palo Alto, people who serve the community. It was pretty amazing to me that just in 2013 we had the Maybell referendum, and we had so many people saying that the city's completely built out, we can't accommodate any more growth, and there were many reasons for people to reject the housing project in Maybell. But that was one of the things you kept on hearing over and over again. This year, for some reason, the city is built out. The line has kind of faded away. Now we had 11 people running for council, almost all of them, from both camps in the political spectrum. saying that we need to find a housing, at least for those who can't afford the market rates. There's a bigger debate about market rate housing. Not everybody's on board on that, but at least for the kind of the public servants, I feel like people, there's a general consensus that emerged.
Yeah.
Are there any projects that the council considered, approved, rejected this year that kind of illustrate this issue to you in any sort of way?
A couple. First of all, we mentioned the Mabel referendum. I think the only housing development that really got approved was the revised version of that, which is, I think it's a dozen or 16 single-family homes. So certainly not the kind of thing that's going to make a ripple when it comes to affordability crisis, but that got approved for that Mabel site. But I think more important, I think, is the project that they're thinking about right now on El Camino and Page Mill. And I think that's more important because it symbolizes a new way of looking at housing, and if it gets approved, it could kind of pave the way for many more projects of that sort. And what we're talking here is 60 micro units. They wouldn't necessarily be affordable, but it's for people, millennials, tech workers, people who don't need as much space, but who prioritize, having, home close to work. And I think just a few years ago, the same site, there was a proposal for an office project with some mixed use. So I think the change from that to not just housing, but micro-unit housing that would be more affordable is like a perfect illustration of how the city's thinking has changed just in the past couple of years.
Yeah, that alone symbolizes the shift.
So Gennady, also, not to make a pun, or maybe to make a pun, there's another issue that's been really kind of affecting this whole conversation, and that's traffic. How much of a driver do you think that is in terms of?
That's the pun.
Yeah, that's the pun. You knew it was coming. How much of a driver do you think that is now in terms of this change in people's attitudes? Because certainly, as the economy has boomed, we have seen tremendous increases in traffic.
I think it's a sub-issue. I think everybody recognizes that there's a nexus between housing and traffic. If people live closer to work, they don't have to drive as far, and that makes things easier for everyone. But I think the part of it that really gets more people kind of to get active in this is the issue of people getting priced out. And Buena Vista is very visible because you have like a huge crowd coming in, coordinated. They all have the same T-shirts and have huge community support, friends groups, school board, council on board, everybody kind of fighting to preserve their homes. But even leaving Buena Vista aside, you've had teachers and you had like medical professionals, you had lawyers and you had tech people coming in saying they can't afford to live here anymore. So I think the issue of getting priced out or of being an empty nest senior and not having like a smaller apartment you can move into, I feel like that's kind of more of a driver in this case, with traffic being like a sub-issue.
And there was also even a planning and transportation commissioner who left. Isn't that true? Wasn't that somebody who left because of the housing and made it very visible?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's Kate Downing, as you know, the story's gone national. She had a very public resignation, and I think it struck a chord with journalists and housing activists and everybody throughout the nation, which she basically said the housing policies here are way too restrictive. It's a bunch of BS. I'm going to Santa Cruz. So
what I found interesting at the very beginning of the year was that we had a cover, and when you were talking about the housing crisis, and I believe we put a millennial-looking person on the cover, and we got the pushback that this housing is not. We're not talking about millennials looking for affordable housing. We're talking about the broad spectrum,
right.
And that certainly is a idea that evolved and became more presented. Throughout the rest of the year.
Technically, our cover was correct. Millennials were looking for housing. It's just many other people were too.
Yeah. Micro units, micro housing, that's really a fascinating idea. It wasn't, it was promoted maybe by a small section of the community earlier in previous years, the idea of very small units that are near public transportation, this whole kind of different lifestyle, carless, no parking. And that's kind of taken on a life of its own. Now people are talking about even breaking the 50-foot height limit maybe and concentrating that kind of housing. It seems like it's gotten more support now than before. Before it was a little bit kind of an outlier.
Oh, it has. Absolutely. There's been talk in recent meetings about allowing the 50-foot height limit to be broken for things like, for example, housing projects that are right next to the Caltrain corridor or we're not saying like 100 feet, but maybe 55, 60. But even breaking it a little bit, there might be a slippery slope to go further. For the next council, who knows? And there's also talk about bringing back our old friend PC zoning, which is a gift to journalism. But and basically, but make
Exemptions in exchange for public benefits.
yeah, recognizing that in the past it's been used primarily for affordable housing. In the distant past, more recently it's been more commercially focused, and that's where most of the controversy arises. So right now the council is considering bringing it back, but just having it be for affordable housing, meaning that if you want to build affordable housing, you could exceed the city's zoning regulations.
Is that being driven by the new council members, or is that something that was already going on?
Oh no, it's been going on because
Okay.
the new people haven't started yet. But
That's
so,
right.
So yeah, but
School board is earlier than you guys.
that's right. And
there's also
you guys are ahead, but it's hard to imagine when the new people do arrive that they won't be on board because
Yeah.
they have been a little more open to kind of more
let's-
expansive growth
Yeah,
policies.
let's talk about the election and what role housing played in the campaign rhetoric. How did that shift maybe who we expected to elect and who some people expected to be elected and then who actually ended up being elected?
Well, I feel like after 2013 and 2014, there was twin victories for the residentialists. First the Maybell, and then the council majority. It went to them the following year in 2014. Arthur Keller was like a residentialist kind of star. He was on the planning commission for a long time. He's very skeptical of, new developments. So expected him to do really well. But what we saw this year, the candidates who were supported by Palo Alto Forward, Kate Downing, by the Chamber of Commerce, who thought that the new majority is going too far and being too restrictive. Those candidates did really well, and I thought it was interesting looking at the precinct map that was released right after the election day, seeing how widespread the support for the kind of slightly more pro-growth, what we call MIMBY-PIMBYs. Maybe my backyard,
Maybe.
possibly my backyard. Yeah, so for them, it was pretty much widespread, except for the neighborhoods where the Arthur Keller and Lydia Koo live, or kind of, those neighborhoods came out for them, but it was a little bit, it was definitely a shift seeing how much support the more pro-growth people got. And I think the new consensus on housing and the work by Palo Alto Forward and, that kind of contributed a lot to that.
Was Palo Alto Forward a main driver in this housing discussion then? Who would you identify as being kind of significant players in this issue?
Don't know if they're the main. I mean, I feel like they're pretty a big umbrella group, and if you want to think strictly about what they do, it's kind of educational, kind of outreach things. They invite everybody to come in for when they host a expert giving kind of seminars on traffic and housing. So I don't think they're really a political group, but they are kind of a room where people can come together to talk about these sort of things. I think the main players, I feel are the people who've been rallying about displacement. Just the people coming in and talking about, the teachers, the Buena Vista people. And on the council, I feel like it's council members like Corey Walbeck, whose voice became much more forceful in this past year. I feel like he maybe had a year to kind of learn the ropes, but he did kind of emerge as kind of one of the leaders of the We Need Much More Housing group. Yeah. And
he's identified his issues and he's moving forward with them.
Yeah, and next year he's going to be the Karen Holman of 2017. A vocal minority that's suddenly in majority and could now probably pursue more of the policies he was talking about, where he couldn't get support in the last few years.
Yeah. Accessory dwelling units was one thing that came up with the Planning Commission late in the year. And I was actually surprised. It seems like on Town Square there's one view and in the council chambers there was another view. How are people feeling now about these accessory units, whether built in one's backyard or even a conversion of space? Has anything changed from the years prior to now, do you think?
I feel like they're just being referred to a lot more than they used to be. They're much more in the conversation, but at the same time, I still think there's a recognition that even if the city does make it a lot easier, it'll still be just kind of like a drop in the bucket when it comes to solving the housing problem. When we were talking about 4 being built per year.
Right.
So you could make it a lot more if you change the requirements for the lot size, because this Palo Alto's lot size requirements are such that unless you have a really big property, you can't even start the process of building one of those.
Yeah.
So I do feel like there is much more talk about relaxing those regulations and encouraging more granny units, but it's hard for me, based on recent history, to imagine that there would be a sea change in solving the affordable housing crisis just with that alone.
Yeah.
It's a small piece of a much larger set of tools.
So do you think housing advocates are banking really then on micro units or higher density housing as being a part of the solution? A
Absolutely.
significant part?
Yeah, I think new housing developments, I think getting past the 50-foot height limit, and strangely enough, some of the people who are more pro-growth were talking during the election that they want to keep the 50-foot height limit, like, or they're not ready to get past it, like people like Adrian Fine. I'd be curious to see how his thinking on that evolves, or whether that was just election rhetoric, because he hasn't been entirely consistent. So it's one of those things that I think it would be interesting to see in the next year or two. What happens with the PC zone, what happens with the height limit, because I feel like those are the two things that could really move the needle when it comes to affordable housing and housing in general.
Well, a lot happened this year, and thanks for connecting all the dots, disparate dots, but ones that really added up to a different narrative on housing. So
My pleasure.
thank you for that. Another story that became a nationally recognized was the Brock Turner case, the trial of Brock Turner, the Stanford all-star swimmer who was arrested for sexual assault on campus in 2015. This was quite a wild ride for you, Elena. The case, you were there from the very beginning, covering the arrest and then the sentencing, the lenient sentencing, just kind of exploded. So talk to us a little bit about what that was like to cover the trial and to see this issue just keep changing and evolving and where it stands. Yeah.
I mean, thinking back on this past year, there was certainly a lot of interest after he was arrested in January of last year, and sort of following the case as it slowly moved through, given, he was an athlete at an elite university. Stanford had already sort of been under the spotlight for its handling of sexual violence cases. But it really wasn't until the sentencing that it just totally erupted. And I think that was a combination of, the actual sentencing itself, which was only 6 months, which he eventually only served half of, especially after coming after the jury's unanimous conviction of him, which was seen as sort of a victory after, so few cases end up being prosecuted anyway. So the combination of that, and then also, of course, the victim's letter, which went totally viral internationally, just completely exploded.
Yeah, she had a very strong, poignant statement.
Which she read in court, and even at the trial, which was right here in Palo Alto. Some days I was the only reporter there, so it was sort of, in and out people's attention to it. But then after that, and since his sentencing, I think there's been a really sustained, dialogue about both his case, sexual assault in general at college campuses, even more so than it had been in the past few years when it really started to become a more visible issue.
Yeah, you've turned the spotlight on sexual assault on campuses for a couple of years now, and I would say that the attention that was paid to the Brock Turner trial in some ways was facilitated or set up by another person who stepped forward, which was Leah Francis, on the Stanford campus, raising awareness about the administration's handling of her case. So do you think that maybe this Brock Turner case was in some ways ripe? I mean, the context and the attention had already been paid to sexual violence, such that when this case came forward, there was already a consciousness.
I think so. I think regardless, just the facts of the case, all-star swimmer found on top of an unconscious woman on campus outside a fraternity party. The unique fact that two graduate students saw and intervened, so there were witnesses, he was arrested. It's not to say that this case is an anomaly, but it's so many other cases like Leah Francis's at Stanford and other universities, it takes the students themselves choosing to go public to talk about it, to really reveal the facts of the case. And this became very public very quickly for many reasons. And because it was a court case, was also public, so it wasn't subject to as a reporter trying to get documents from Stanford, which is impossible unless a student releases them because it's a private university. So it was a different case to cover.
Yeah. There were a lot of nuances, I thought, as the case unfolded, and I compliment you on how you kind of handled these issues. One of them was, hey, they were both drunk at the time. There's that kind of whole ethos around, like, whose responsibility is it really? And then there was also the idea of all-star swimmer. Was he being favored in some way? Whether by the judge or just by the handling of the case.
Alcohol was a really central part of the trial on both, the prosecution and the defense's sides, in terms of talking about consent and when you're blacked out. Can you give consent, and what does it mean for the other person you're interacting with?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people viewed his conviction as sort of a referendum on this misperception that rape and sexual assault is just sort of a alcohol-fueled misunderstanding between two people, and we can't really do much about it.
Right.
And then so when the sentencing came down, it was sort of this shock of like, well, no, we're still kind of there for some people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole recall issue that you
Yeah.
also followed, the recall of Judge Persky.
Yeah, and so that's continuing. Michelle Dauber, who's a Stanford law professor and a friend of the victim in the Brock Turner case, is leading that effort. I spoke to her recently, and she actually said that they've, I think, almost raised enough money to put this on the ballot next year. So that is something certainly we will see in 2017.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to highlight her, and maybe there's others that you can think of, as being kind of a significant mover in this case. And she's been there with the students on campus, giving them support and advice. She's also a family friend of the victim in this case, the Brock Turner case. Tell me who you see kind of as being key players in this Brock Turner issue.
She certainly is one, Michelle, and it was interesting because she, like you said, she was involved in supporting students at Stanford, and she helped write one of their new disciplinary process for adjudicating sexual assault cases, and so she was very actively working on reform at Stanford. And then once this case happened, she's sort of been catapulted to the next level of being at the sort of the face of this national recall campaign. Other people, I was going to talk about Judge Persky as just an actor in it, certainly, and he's been pretty vilified for the sentence that he gave.
Deputy DA as well.
Yeah, LLA Kianirsi, so she prosecuted the case. And we should also mention that this case inspired legislation that was adopted this year that established mandatory minimum sentencing for people who get arrested for the crime that Brock committed.
At the state level.
Yeah, so lots of long-lasting impact from the case.
And a cameo from our vice president, right?
That's
That's
true.
right,
Joe
yeah.
Biden wrote an open letter to the victim after her statement came out, and her letter was read in full in Congress on the House floor. So many. I have a Brock Turner Google alert, and I continue to get references to her letter, to him, to the case, in local and national media, definitely every week. So it's still very much an issue.
She was named Glamour, one of the Glamour
Women of the
magazine
Year.
Women of the Year. She really stood up and was able to voice a lot of, I think, the feelings and just thoughts of victims.
How much of all of this exposure has changed Stanford? Has it changed Stanford's way of doing things in any significant way?
It's hard
The
to
university
say.
must have been embarrassed by all of this.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people viewed it as sort of a lost opportunity for Stanford in terms of they could have used it as sort of a teaching moment to talk about consent and send a message about drinking alcohol on campus. And I think they from their perspective they started a new alcohol ban this year. They started new sexual assault education for students. But there's certainly still a really widespread perception, particularly among students, that there's a desire to sweep things under the rug, and it's more about protecting the Stanford brand than supporting students and sort of owning up to what has been done in the past and just moving forward.
And there's a
with things
lawsuit
like-
now, right? Isn't there?
Yeah, there's 2 lawsuits from students. The main one that happened last week was a young woman who is suing Stanford for basically failing to protect her and other women at Stanford from a same male student who had been reported by multiple women to have sexually and physically assaulted them. So she's seeking damages to be determined at a jury trial. So that could also become a public platform for more of these issues.
Elena, this trial was your first big legal case that you covered. Can you speak at all to the challenges that you saw or faced as a journalist in just tracking this and making sure that everything was accurate and publicized?
Yeah, I just think the nuances of what he was charged with, all the different arguments in court, it was really important to get those right. And I think a lot of when the national media dropped into this case, they would sort of gloss over the facts and pay attention to the most interesting details of it, which wasn't necessarily always accurate. So just maintaining that level of detail, I think, was really important, and it was hard to do. It was an emotional case. That trial was it was graphic, but
What about the camp out when he was being released?
oh,
That seemed like quite an experience.
yeah. So the night that he was supposed to get out of jail potentially at midnight this summer. So I went to the San Jose main jail late that night and stayed through the night until 6 a.m. when he
That's when he was
eventually
actually
got
released.
out. There were some indications maybe he'd come out at 2 a.m. So that was quite an experience. And there was a small sort of group of media there the whole night. And then once 5 a.m. hit, it was just flooded. There was a helicopter. And it was this crazy experience. And then he came out and just walked through this, gauntlet of cameras and reporters screaming at him, and got into his car and left. And that was sort of the last we've seen of him.
Yeah.
Media circus. Wow.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, this whole case has been like that, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your dedication to this case and for bringing in the facts and clarifying all the nuances for our readers.
Thank you.
Another person who's been dedicated to an issue is Sue, and you've been covering airplane noise
Yes.
for quite a while now, and there's been quite an uproar about that. This year saw some action that I think is pretty interesting. So can you set us up a little bit with where we were at the beginning of the year?
Sure. Well, residents made it loud and clear that they were really upset about the amount of traffic, air traffic and noise. And just to frame what this was about, the FAA received a mandate from Congress to revamp its air traffic system. And so they did so. They came up with a whole plan nationwide called Next Gen. And in 2015, they rolled out the Northern California one that had a portion of Next Gen that mainly had to do with flights at San Francisco International Airport. So the main problem has been arrivals of flights, and they came in on a different track, which really affected mostly Palo Alto in a big way, because Palo Alto is sort of the nexus of three tracks of air traffic coming in from the north and making a loop to come into SFO, traffic coming in from the south, and I believe there's another one that sort of comes from Oakland. It kind of comes down, also makes a loop and goes up.
People call it the superhighway.
Yes, the superhighway in the sky. So. And a lot of the reason for this is that they want to pack more planes in. This is to basically set up the skies, the airways for future growth, including the use of drones, commercial drones, and they need to have
They want to
dedicated
clear out a certain
dedicated
level of
airspace for
altitude
that, because
space.
they can't be competing with jets.
Yes. One of the things that I found was interesting that happened this year was it seems like there was a consensus around the disturbance that this is creating, the disruption to people's quality of life.
Yeah.
So there was a consensus around that, but when it came time to actually proposing solutions, then there was this split
Okay.
among
So-
different residents in different regions.
So the next thing that came out of this is that residents groups like Sky Posse and other local groups, they got the ear of Anna Eshu mainly. She was the main person involved in helping to create a committee that was based on, there was a 12-person committee based on people from counties, mostly elected officials, counties and city officials. And they got together to take a proposal and try to figure out and analyze a proposal for how they could mitigate some of the noise. And that became something where it split whole communities. So you had factions in Santa Cruz who wanted to go back to the way things were, because there was a flight path that basically came from Big Sur, and it moved, I believe, a little further north. It was further north before, and it has since shifted to another flight path that was called Surfer, that basically came over from the ocean and cut across Palo Alto. And the changes is that when they came in, they had to basically, one of the things happened, for example, is they had to stay out of restricted airspace. So to come in, they came in at a let's say, a steeper angle, and they had to use things like speed brakes and things that throttling back and made lots of noise, the whistling that you hear, the roaring, that kind of sound when the planes would come in. And so that, and they came in at a lower elevation, a lower altitude as well. So that all increased the noise, and it put the noise over communities that hadn't experienced it, at least at that level before.
Yeah, one of the problems with airplane noise in general is that planes have to fly over someone. I mean, unless you're finding open space, which I was at Yosemite a couple of years ago, and we were camping out, and there were planes that were like, I don't know how close they were, but they were going right over us, and
Yeah.
I mean, that's not something that people find pleasant either. But airplanes have to go over somebody,
Right.
correct, and they have to go over. I think it seems like what was under discussion was in part, we don't want it over us. Why don't you move it over so and so, or why don't you move it over someone else? No one wants to say that that's what they're doing, but
Well, that was the whole argument about noise being moved. I mean, there were people in Santa Cruz County, who said this: we didn't experience this noise before. Well, they may have experienced some of it, but it came in a much higher altitude. So if it's, let's just throw out a number. If it's the difference between 12,000 feet and 8,000 feet, you may notice a tremendous difference. Now, for Palo Alto, they were supposed to keep. There had been an agreement before that this point at which the planes sort of track over different points, and they have to be over those points as they're coming down, so they stay on a flight path, basically. And there's one in Menlo Park near Willow Road, which basically is called it's Menlo Waypoint. They call them waypoints. And they were supposed to stay at 5,000 feet. That was an agreement that had been worked out with former city mayor, Palo Alto City Mayor Gary Fazzino and Anna Eshoo, and some years ago. And they actually were not staying at 5,000 feet like they said they would. They were coming in at 4,000 feet or 3,500 feet. People were tracking this because they were basically using SFO's own tracking system to show where the violations were. So you have a lot of people who say, we didn't experience this. You have people on the coast who said we didn't experience this before, or in the mountains they said we didn't experience this before. So take it off of us and put it back the way it was.
right.
But
Well, it was moved for a reason, though.
Yeah,
I mean, you
yeah.
can't just revert everything back to where it was.
they can't really revert it back to where it was.
So this committee. Oh, were you going to say
Okay,
something?
I was just curious if you were surprised that this became such a divisive issue when you're between different communities and people on different sides of it. And
I think what really was kind of surprising was the amount of anger and, I mean, certainly people were angry, but you're right, people were more divided. When I used to go to the earlier meetings that had to do with like Surf Air, which is a prop type plane that comes out of, smaller commuter plane that comes out of San Carlos Airport, you would have people in Atherton who were talking about this, and you would have Palo Altans there, and they wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to end up over them, too. But it seemed like a more civil discourse. And this discourse there was a lot of intimidation. There were a lot of people who felt really like, they would tell me things and they'd say, Palo Alto people would say, I'm telling you these things, but I'm telling you them off the record because if I go public with them, that I'm gonna be hearing from these people from Santa Cruz. They're gonna give me a hard time. So there were a lot of that, and it's not to say that it's only the Santa Cruz people, but they were saying negative things to others, but they were certainly there was a huge faction of them that would show up at the meetings wearing red shirts all the time, and they were very well organized, and they really exerted a lot of political pressure to get what they wanted, and they did get what they wanted ultimately.
It seems like there were a number of challenges in covering this issue over the years, and especially this year as the different proposals were made. It seems like one of them is just simply understanding what is being proposed and the technical issues having to do with altitudes and flight paths and throttling or not throttling.
Oh yeah, and if you didn't follow it consistently, which sometimes I didn't, it was really daunting. I mean, it was just, you'd go into a meeting and it was nothing but acronyms, and it's like people who had followed it all of the time. The residents who've been there all the time were really well versed, and they would sit down with me and they would kind of explain
So
some of these
them
things.
helped you.
They did. They helped me to
understand the
explain it, break it down into bites, smaller chunks or smaller bites, so that there was a lot of extraneous stuff that I really didn't have to deal with. In some ways, it's a blessing that we're hyper-local because it means our coverage doesn't have to be regional on this issue, you know.
Yeah.
But the getting back to sort of what really was a big change this year was the Select Committee on South Bay Arrivals, which is that 12-member committee I was talking about.
Yeah.
It was put together by Anna Eshu, and it started about FAA agreed to have this committee make recommendations. None of this is cast in stone. It's not an edict of any sort that they have to follow. But
Yeah, they had several community meetings this year,
Yeah,
and then
the
eventually
start-
came up with their own recommendations.
right, the
And in
meetings.
the interest of time, maybe we can just, where are we right now with
Okay,
those recommendations?
so the recommendations essentially now they came up with a proposal, not proposal, but recommendations that essentially say move that flight path and move it back to where it was before, but of course it won't be exactly the same. So they're talking about maybe bringing things in, find a way to keep the planes up higher and bring them, and methodologies that will not require the braking and the things, the noise producing
yeah.
elements. And also, when it comes over the Menlo waypoint, to keep it at 5,000 feet. So they had various suggestions that maybe FAA will be able to work on. They'll certainly take it back to the drawing board, and then they have to run it past their superiors and see if there's anything that would come out of it. One of the things that the committee members really strongly advised, however, is that their work is done, they're breaking up, but they said, we need to have an ongoing and even permanent committee of some sort made up of aviation professionals and residents,
residents,
different people that would be involved in this to monitor this, because we don't want to have it, them say, okay, we've stamped this, we've made the changes and that's the end of it, and we're not going back there. We really need to see what works and what doesn't work.
Sure, these are proposals, but who knows how it's actually going to turn out. There might be some fine tuning.
That's right.
needed or
There may be
tweaking.
fine tuning that's needed, and it'll be interesting to see how seriously FAA takes the recommendations, because they may decide not to do any of it at all. The
Interesting.
chances are, though, it seems like they will, because they seem to really, they recognize there is a problem in the Bay Area, and they seem to want to do something about
Yeah.
it.
Well, details to come then. Sue and Elena and Gennady, thank you so much for your reporting this year and for bringing these issues to our reporters. We look forward to a exciting 2017, whatever may come. That wraps it up for this year of webcasts. If you like what you've heard, we'll be continuing them in 2017. So you can click subscribe below or hit like. You can also follow us on Twitter at Palo Alto Weekly. If you want to comment on any of these issues, go to paloaltoonline.com/square. I'm Jocelyn Dong, and wishing you a Happy New Year.